Teach her a lesson in humility. That was the exact sentence my mother muttered as she took a sharp blade to my custom wedding dress. She didn't know that the smoke detector right above her head was actually a hidden camera. My parents completely destroyed my wedding, or at least they tried to, simply because my wedding date coincided with the day my sister suddenly decided to get married. They broke into my sanctuary. They smashed my bridal portraits, trashed my room, and ruthlessly ruined the dress I had spent an entire year preparing. Teach her a lesson in humility. When I came home and saw the destruction, I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't scream. I just stood in the middle of the wreckage, my stomach tying itself into sick knots, and quietly picked up a single pearl that had been ripped from the fabric. I let them think they had broken me. I let them show up to my ceremony, arrogant, entitled, and ready to humiliate me in front of everyone. But they had absolutely no idea that a few hours later, the MC would unexpectedly announce a video presentation that I supposedly hadn't authorized. And when that massive screen lit up, an absolute suffocating silence swallowed the entire room. My name is Autumn. I'm 32 years old, an architect who always believed that family was supposed to be your safest place. I was dead wrong. Before I reveal exactly what the guests saw on that screen and how I systematically dismantled my family's pride, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. Have you ever been betrayed by the very people who share your blood? Drop your experiences down below. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, and let's get into the story. The clinking of crystal wine glasses and the rich scent of roasted turkey filled the dining room, masking the toxic undercurrent that had always defined our family gatherings. It was Thanksgiving dinner, a time supposedly meant for gratitude, but the air felt heavy with unspoken competition. Across the mahogany table sat my younger sister Hazel. At 29, she was a former local beauty queen whose shimmering tiara had long since lost its luster. For years, she had thrived on being the absolute center of attention, riding the wave of her teenage pageants. Lately, however, her modeling gigs had dried up, and her social media presence was fading into irrelevance. She was desperate for a grand, highly publicized event to rebrand herself and reclaim her title as the perfect, flawless darling of the family. Sitting beside me was Levi, my fiancé. At 34, with a sharp, analytical mind suited for his career as a network engineer, he was my grounding force. He squeezed my hand beneath the table, silently encouraging me to share our good news. We had spent the entire morning finalizing the paperwork and transferring a significant portion of our hard-earned savings. Levi and I have officially locked in our venue, I announced, keeping my voice steady but undeniably joyful. We secured the Silver Vines estate on the outskirts of Kansas City. The outdoor pavilion is gorgeous and the date is set for mid-October next year. Levi smiled, raising his glass slightly. It wasn't easy to get that specific weekend, but Autumn fell in love with the landscape. I expected cheers, or at least a warm toast. Instead, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the dining room. I watched Hazel's manicured fingers tighten around her wine glass. Her perfectly contoured face went rigid and her eyes darkened with a flash of unmistakable resentment. My father, Joseph, a 59-year-old owner of a mid-sized construction contracting firm, cleared his throat. He was a man who valued appearances and control above all else. "That's nice, sweetheart," he muttered, his tone dismissive as he immediately shifted his gaze away from me. Next to him, my mother, Jane, a 58-year-old real estate agent who treated every family interaction like a calculated negotiation, offered a stiff, practiced smile. A vineyard is charming, very rustic. The lukewarm reception stung, but I was used to it. I thought that would be the end of the discussion. I was completely wrong. The real performance began just as the dessert plates were being cleared away. Hazel suddenly let out a theatrical sigh, her lower lip trembling. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, drawing everyone's immediate attention. "I actually have some news too," she murmured, her voice laced with a fragile victim-like tremor. Mark and I are getting married. Before I could even process the suddenness of this announcement, considering she and her boyfriend had been constantly breaking up and getting back together for 2 years, she dropped the actual bomb. We went venue shopping yesterday. Hazel continued, a single perfectly timed tear escaping her eyelashes. The only place that fits my vision, the Grand Plaza downtown, has a massive waiting list. The manager told me they only had one single Saturday available for the entire fall season. So I took it. She paused, looking directly into my eyes across the table. It's the exact same day as yours, Autumn. The dining room fell dead silent. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. Out of 52 weekends in a year, she had intentionally hijacked my chosen date. She didn't just want a wedding, she wanted to force our guests to choose. She wanted a public popularity contest. I waited for my parents to intervene to point out the glaring logistical nightmare of having 2 daughters marrying on the exact same afternoon in different locations. Instead, the gaslighting commenced with practiced precision. "Oh, my poor girl," Jane cooed, reaching across the table to stroke Hazel's hand. She then turned her sharp gaze toward me, her tone instantly shifting to that of a patronizing mediator. "Autumn, you know how much Hazel has been struggling lately with her career. She needs this win. The Grand Plaza is a spectacular venue for her image." Joseph leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, using his authoritative contractor voice to lay down the law. "You and Levi are financially stable. You're older, you're settled. Hazel's situation is much more delicate right now. I think the right thing to do here for the sake of family harmony is for you to push your wedding back. Just postpone it for a year. Let your sister have her moment in the sun." I stared at the 3 of them. My own father was asking me to dismantle 18 months of meticulous planning and forfeit thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits simply because my younger sister could not stand to share the spotlight, let alone let me have it entirely. They weren't asking for a compromise. They were demanding a sacrifice. They were dressing up blatant favoritism in the noble costume of familial duty. "You're asking me to cancel my wedding day so Hazel can have a PR event?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Don't be so dramatic and selfish." Joseph snapped, his face flushing with anger. "It is just a date on a calendar. Your sister is fragile right now. We need to support her." "A year goes by fast, Autumn," Jane added smoothly, pouring herself another glass of wine. "You've always been the independent one. You don't need the attention like she does. Be the bigger person." I looked at Hazel. Behind the faux tears, there was a faint triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had played her hand perfectly, knowing our parents would act as her personal shield and sword. Levi shifted beside me, his jaw clenched tight, ready to unleash his fury, but I placed a gentle hand on his knee to stop him. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked directly at my father, then my mother, and finally let a thin, cold smile touch my lips. "No," I said softly, but the word carried the weight of an iron door slamming shut. "I am not moving my date. Not by a year, not by a single day." Joseph's fist hit the table, rattling the silverware. "Excuse me. You heard me?" I replied, standing up from my chair and tossing my napkin onto my half-eaten dessert. "My date is locked. You can either attend your eldest daughter's wedding at the Vineyard or you can go to the Grand Plaza. The choice is entirely yours." Without waiting for their explosive response, Levi and I walked out of the dining room, leaving the house behind. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, I knew I hadn't just declined a simple request. I had officially ignited a silent, ruthless war that would eventually burn this family to the ground. My unwavering refusal to back down did not halt my parents' ambitions. It merely forced them to pivot their offensive strategy toward a far more ruthless and unpredictable angle. The glow of 2 laptop screens illuminated the otherwise dark home office. Levi and I were buried under a mountain of digital paperwork, preparing for a rigorous mortgage pre-approval process. Buying a house in the current market required an immaculate financial portfolio, so we were meticulously combing through every single asset tax return and savings account we possessed. My primary financial safety net was a high-yield investment fund I had established years ago when I first began taking on independent architectural projects. Because my work often required me to travel out of state for site inspections, I had legally granted Joseph a durable power of attorney over that specific account. It was a practical arrangement at the time, allowing him to sign off on urgent material procurements and permit fees on my behalf. It was built on a foundation of absolute trust, the kind of trust a daughter naturally places in her father. Levi was navigating through the banking portal, downloading the latest quarterly statements for the underwriter, when the rapid clicking of his mouse suddenly stopped. He leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in his eyes, his brow furrowing into a deep, troubled V. "Autumn," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed register that immediately made my stomach tighten. "Come look at this." I rolled my chair over to his desk, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers on the high-definition display. I was expecting to see a healthy compounding balance, the result of years of late nights drafting blueprints and managing difficult clients. Instead, I saw a crater. $85,000 was gone. My brain struggled to process the math. I blinked hard, thinking it was a glitch in the banking interface or a temporary hold for a pending trade. But the ledger was brutally clear. The balance had plummeted, drained by 3 massive consecutive wire transfers executed over the past month. "Did you authorize any heavy investments recently?" Levi asked gently, though the look on his face told me he already suspected the answer. "No," I whispered, feeling the blood drain from my face. "I haven't touched this portfolio since last spring." Levi's fingers flew across the keyboard, his network engineering background kicking into high gear. He didn't just look at the missing numbers. He hunted for the destination. Joseph was cunning, but he wasn't a digital native. He hadn't simply wired the money directly into Hazel's personal checking account. Doing so would have triggered an immediate alert and left an undeniable paper trail of theft. Instead, the transaction history showed that the funds had been routed to an entity called Crescent Valley Materials. To a casual observer or even a bank teller, it looked like a perfectly normal business expense: an architect and a construction contractor paying a supplier for high-grade lumber or imported stone. It was a brilliant, sterile disguise, but Levi was relentless. He pulled up the Missouri Secretary of State's public business database, a tool completely accessible to anyone who knew what to look for. He typed in the exact legal name of the supposed vendor. The system hummed for a second before spitting out the registration documents. "Look at the filing date." Levi pointed at the screen. The LLC had been formed exactly 3 weeks ago, right around the time I had firmly denied my family's demand to change my wedding date. Levi dug deeper, pulling the articles of organization to find the registered agent. Crescent Valley Materials did not have a warehouse address. It didn't belong to an industrial park or a lumber yard. The registered business address was a suite number located in a highly exclusive upscale commercial high-rise in the heart of downtown Kansas City. Without saying a word, Levi copied the address and pasted it into a standard search engine. The results loaded instantly, displaying a sleek, minimalist website adorned with images of crystal chandeliers, cascading floral arrangements, and flowing champagne. It was the official headquarters of Lumiere Events, the premier ultra-luxury wedding planning agency that held an exclusive ironclad contract with the Grand Plaza. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening, violent clarity. My father hadn't just favored his younger daughter. He had executed a calculated, sophisticated embezzlement scheme. Utilizing the legal loophole provided by his power of attorney, he had systematically drained the lifeblood of my future business. He had created a shell company, forged fake construction material invoices to bypass the bank's fraud detection algorithms, and effectively laundered $85,000 of my money to finance Hazel's extravagant, attention-seeking spectacle. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. The betrayal was no longer just emotional, it was a felony. In the eyes of the law, Joseph's actions constituted a severe breach of fiduciary duty. He had weaponized the legal authority I gave him to protect me, using it instead to financially execute me. I stared at the glowing logo of the wedding planning agency on the monitor. The heat of anger that usually follows an argument was entirely absent. In its place was an arctic, terrifying numbness. My father had looked me in the eyes over Thanksgiving dinner, demanding I sacrifice my happiness, knowing full well he was already in the process of bleeding my bank accounts dry to pay for his golden child's fantasy. Levi reached out gently, closing the laptop screen, effectively plunging the room back into semi-darkness. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, but he didn't offer any empty platitudes. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay because we both knew that the family I grew up in was dead. I rested my forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, reliable rhythm of his heartbeat. The realization settled deep into my bones, heavy and undeniable. They weren't just toxic relatives anymore. They were thieves. And thieves did not deserve the courtesy of a daughter's silence. Armed with the irrefutable evidence of both the malicious vandalism of my bridal gown and the elaborate corporate embezzlement scheme, I chose a very different path. I refused to scream, cry, or throw a tantrum like a naive child stripped of her candy. Confronting my parents in the heat of the moment would only give them the critical advantage of time. They would immediately scramble to hire elite defense attorneys, invent a plausible narrative for the missing funds, or funnel the stolen assets into untraceable offshore accounts. For my retaliation to be absolute, they needed to feel victorious. They needed to firmly believe they had successfully crushed my spirit and bent me to their will. I transitioned from a victim into the meticulous director of my own family's tragedy. I orchestrated a quiet, mid-afternoon sit-down at an exclusive, dimly lit tea room in the Crossroads Arts District. When Joseph and Jane arrived, I made sure my physical posture reflected complete submission. I kept my shoulders slumped, my voice barely above a fragile whisper, and my eyes cast downward absent-mindedly, tracing the gold rim of my porcelain teacup. I don't want to lose my family over a conflict on a calendar, I murmured carefully, injecting just the right amount of manufactured defeat and exhaustion into my tone. I know Hazel needs this spotlight. I know her career revival depends on a flawless, highly attended evening. I then laid out the trap disguised as a desperate compromise. My ceremony at the vineyard was scheduled for the early afternoon. I proposed that they attend my vow exchange, stand beside me for the mandatory family portraits, and then discreetly leave the estate before the dinner reception even began. This specific timeline would give them a comfortable 45-minute window to drive from the rural outskirts back into downtown Kansas City, change into their formal evening wear, and arrive at the Grand Plaza perfectly on time for Hazel's extravagant grand entrance. Jane reached across the small wrought iron table, her manicured fingers patting my hand with suffocating condescension. A triumphant, almost predatory smile stretched across her meticulously maintained face. "I always knew you were the sensible one, Autumn." She purred, her eyes gleaming with the deep satisfaction of a conqueror claiming her spoils. "This is maturity. You are finally doing the right thing for your sister. Family requires sacrifice." Beside her, Joseph gave a stiff, authoritative nod of approval, his chest puffing out slightly as he praised my newfound humility. They finished their Earl Grey tea in a state of supreme relaxation, utterly convinced that their campaign of psychological manipulation and financial theft had successfully forced me into permanent submission. They genuinely believed I was bowing out gracefully. But behind that mask of a yielding, obedient daughter, I was ruthlessly engineering the final act of their social destruction. My first hidden move involved the audiovisual architecture for the reception hall. The vineyard offered a standard rudimentary projector and pull-down canvas screen package, which was entirely insufficient for the magnitude of my plan. I completely bypassed the venue's preferred vendor list. Instead, Levi and I quietly signed a strict non-disclosure agreement with a specialized independent theatrical staging company located across the state line in Kansas, ensuring absolutely no gossip could leak back to my family's extensive social circles in Missouri. I commissioned a massive high-definition LED video wall to be installed directly behind the main sweetheart table in the grand reception barn. To ensure the element of absolute paralyzing surprise, the engineering team designed a custom concealment system. They erected a dense floor-to-ceiling curtain of cascading white orchids, intertwined with heavy ivory silk drapes that completely masked the dark reflective glass of the digital screens. To an unsuspecting guest, it looked like a breathtaking, wildly expensive floral backdrop. The technical execution had to be flawless. The entire visual network was hardwired to an encrypted standalone control board to prevent any accidental Bluetooth pairings or interference from the venue's internal Wi-Fi. There would be no technical glitches. The trigger rested entirely on a secure password-protected tablet, safely locked inside a reinforced briefcase that Levi would personally guard. The final crucial touch was the seating arrangement. I ordered a separate, highly embellished batch of VIP invitations, specifically printed for my mother and father. I assigned them the most prestigious placement in the entire venue, table number 1, front row, dead center, sitting directly at the edge of the elevated stage. I even held a private meeting with the lighting director, giving strict instructions to ensure that specific table was bathed in a crisp, clear spotlight during the evening toasts. I wanted to guarantee they had an unobstructed panoramic view of the screen, and I wanted every single guest in the room to be able to see their faces clearly when the truth was unleashed. Every contract was signed and paid in cash. Every digital file was rendered encrypted and rigorously tested on the monitors. The stage was flawlessly set. The technological props were hidden in plain sight, and the key players had willingly and eagerly accepted their front-row tickets to a public sentencing they never saw coming. The bridal suite at the Silver Vines estate was completely devoid of the usual frantic joy that accompanies a wedding morning. The air inside the rustic stone-walled room was sterile and heavy, chilled to a temperature that made every breath feel sharp and audible. There were no bridesmaids popping champagne corks, no tearful mothers adjusting veils, and no chaotic laughter. There was only me, the quiet hum of the air conditioning unit, and the suffocating presence of a ghost hanging in the corner. Suspended from a velvet hanger near the vanity mirror was my original bridal gown. I had insisted on bringing it with me. The once magnificent cascade of silk and hand-sewn pearls now hung limp and defeated the structural seams completely severed by my mother's calculated blade. It was a tangible monument to betrayal, a physical reminder of why I could not allow myself a single moment of weakness today. I refused to let that ruined fabric touch my skin. Wearing it, even if heavily altered or pinned together, would mean walking down the aisle draped in my family's malice. Instead, I stood before the full-length mirror wearing a meticulously tailored ivory crepe suit. The sharp lines of the blazer and the structured cut of the trousers offered no vulnerability. It was not the romantic flowing silhouette I had envisioned as a little girl, but it was exactly what I needed. It was armor. It projected absolute authority, a visual declaration of a woman who was no longer a naive victim waiting for validation, but a calculating architect of her own destiny. A soft, hesitant knock echoed against the heavy oak door. Before I could respond, the brass handle turned and Jane stepped into the suite. She was impeccably dressed in a muted sapphire gown, her hair perfectly coiffed, radiating the aura of a proud, supportive matriarch. She had expected to walk in and find me either frantically trying to repair a mysteriously shredded dress or crying hysterically over a ruined morning. She had come to play the savior, to offer her shoulder for me to cry on after secretly causing the devastation. The moment her eyes landed on my crisp white suit, the practiced maternal smile froze completely on her face. Her gaze darted instinctively toward the corner of the room, briefly registering the sight of the destroyed gown hanging like a forgotten relic. A flicker of genuine panic, a microscopic twitch of her left eyelid betrayed her perfectly composed exterior. She quickly masked it, her mind scrambling to adapt to a script she hadn't written. "Autumn, darling." Jane faltered, her voice lacking its usual smooth, commanding cadence. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning my sharp attire. You changed your mind about the dress. I thought you loved the silk ball gown." I turned away from the mirror, meeting her gaze with a calm, unblinking stare. "I decided the original dress was too fragile for what I need to do today." I replied, my voice dangerously steady, devoid of any warmth or anger. "This suits me much better. Don't you agree?" Jane swallowed hard, her manicured hands fluttering nervously as she adjusted the clasp of her designer clutch. "It's very modern, very bold. As long as you are happy, sweetheart. We are just so thrilled to be here for you, even if it's only for a short while." She was laying the groundwork for their early exit, sticking to the deceptive compromise I had fed them the day before. I simply nodded, offering her a thin, polite smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I know you have a very tight schedule today, Mother. I appreciate you making the effort to witness the vows." While this suffocating psychological chess match was playing out in the bridal suite, a completely different kind of preparation was concluding just a few hundred yards away in the main reception barn. The grand space was currently empty of guests, but the tension was equally palpable. Levi stood near the elevated sweetheart table, partially obscured by the elaborate cascading orchid arrangements that successfully hid the massive LED video wall behind us. He was dressed in a classic black tuxedo, but his demeanor was strictly analytical. In his hands, he held a heavily encrypted military-grade tablet. He was running a final diagnostic check with the independent staging crew. "Signal latency is at 0, Levi murmured to the lead technician, tapping a command onto the touchscreen. "Audio sync is perfectly aligned with the visual feed. Have we secured the secondary backup server?" "Yes, sir," the technician replied, adjusting a small earpiece. "The files are locally hosted on an offline drive. Even if the entire venue loses internet connectivity, the broadcast will execute flawlessly upon your command." Levi nodded, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He swiped through the tablet, briefly pulling up the security footage of Jane's vandalism, followed by the high-resolution images of the forged financial documents linking Joseph to the wedding planning shell company. The digital evidence was a loaded weapon, and Levi's finger was resting lightly on the trigger. He powered down the tablet screen, slipping the device into a customized interior pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He looked toward the barn doors, knowing I would be walking through them shortly. The trap was armed. The technology was foolproof. The targets were completely oblivious, actively walking into the crosshairs while patting themselves on the back for their perceived cunning. Back in the suite, Jane awkwardly excused herself, citing the need to find her designated seat before the processional music began. I watched the heavy oak door click shut behind her. The room returned to its chilling silence. I closed my eyes, taking one final deep breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs. I exhaled slowly, shedding the last remnants of the daughter they thought they knew. It was time. As the somber, resonant notes of a solo cello drifted across the sun-drenched rows of the vineyard, Levi and I began our walk down the aisle. There was no traditional father giving the bride away, only two equal partners stepping forward to claim their future. The outdoor pavilion was breathtaking, bathed in the golden hour light, with nearly 200 guests turning in their wooden folding chairs to watch our approach. Yet my peripheral vision was entirely locked on table number 1. Joseph and Jane were seated exactly where I had placed them, in the VIP section, front and center. They sat with rigid, unnerving posture, exuding an air of superiority. They hadn't come to witness a union. They had come to commandeer a captive audience. We reached the altar, standing before the officiant under a beautifully draped floral arch. The cello faded into a respectful silence. The officiant smiled warmly, opening his leather-bound book to begin the invocation. He didn't even get past the first sentence. "Excuse me, please stop the proceedings." The voice boomed across the silent vineyard, amplified by the sheer commanding volume of a man used to giving orders on construction sites. Joseph stood up from his front row seat. A collective audible gasp rippled through the rows of guests. The officiant froze, looking wildly between Joseph and us, completely untrained for this level of hostility. Joseph took a deliberate step away from his chair, turning slightly so he could address not just the altar, but the entire sea of bewildered guests. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his face twisted into a mask of profound, manufactured sorrow. "It breaks a father's heart to interrupt a moment like this." Joseph began, his baritone voice dripping with a calculated, sickening melancholy. "Jane and I came here today hoping to support our eldest daughter. But standing here looking at this lavish display, my conscience will not allow me to stay silent while this audience is deceived." The silence in the pavilion became suffocating. People stopped breathing. I felt Levi's grip on my hand tighten to the point of pain, his muscles coiled, ready to step in front of me, but I gently squeezed his fingers, silently anchoring him to the spot. I needed Joseph to dig his grave as deep as possible. Autumn has recently launched her independent architectural firm. Joseph continued, projecting his voice, so even the back rows could hear the slander. "What she hasn't told anyone is how she funded it. She maliciously manipulated and drained our family's private financial reserves to bankroll her ambitions, jeopardizing the livelihood of her own flesh and blood." Murmurs erupted like a sudden gust of wind. Whispers of shock and judgment swept through the crowd. Relatives from Levi's side exchanged horrified glances, while some of my extended family members covered their mouths in disbelief. To cement his theatrical performance, Joseph reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a crisp, folded document. He held it up in the golden sunlight for everyone to see. "I hold in my hand a formal notice of pending litigation," he declared, his voice rising in righteous indignation. "We are officially entering a legal property and asset dispute to recover what was stolen from this family. Jane and I cannot in good conscience participate in this charade. We are leaving to attend a celebration built on honesty, the wedding of our youngest daughter, Hazel." Seated just 3 chairs down from where Joseph was standing was Aunt Clara, Jane's 61-year-old sister, and a formidable family law attorney practicing in Chicago. Clara's eyes narrowed sharply behind her designer frames. Her professional instincts flared instantly. She scrutinized the paper Joseph was waving around. Even from a distance, her trained eye noted the absence of a certified court clerk's stamp, the lack of a proper docket number, and the overly dramatic timing of its presentation. It wasn't a legally binding injunction. It was a prop. It was a frivolous, meaningless piece of paper drafted solely for the purpose of public character assassination. Clara's jaw clenched tightly in disgust as she realized the depth of her brother-in-law's manipulative cruelty. Jane stood up gracefully beside her husband, dabbing a completely dry eye with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the devastated, betrayed mother to absolute perfection. They waited for my reaction. They expected me to crumble. They wanted me to burst into tears, to scream denials, to beg them to stop ruining my day, or to run away from the altar in overwhelming shame. They needed the explosive reaction of a victim to validate their performance. Instead, I looked directly into Joseph's expectant eyes. I didn't break eye contact. I didn't frown. Slowly, a serene, unbothered smile spread across my face. I leaned slightly toward the officiant's microphone stand, ensuring my response was broadcast crystal clear through the pavilion's sound system. "Thank you, Joseph, for that incredibly impressive and passionate speech," I said, my voice smooth, light, and utterly, completely devoid of the panic he was so desperately starving for. "Drive safely, and please have a truly spectacular evening with Hazel." Joseph's confident expression faltered for a fraction of a second. The complete lack of resistance caught him entirely off guard. But his pride quickly overrode his confusion. Believing they had dealt a fatal, unrecoverable blow to my reputation, Joseph scoffed, took Jane by the elbow and turned his back on the altar. The two of them marched up the center aisle, their heads held high, footsteps crunching loudly against the gravel. Every eye in the vineyard followed their dramatic exit until they disappeared into the parking lot. The heavy, awkward silence returned to the pavilion thicker than before. The guests were paralyzed, waiting to see if the wedding was effectively canceled. I turned back to the stunned officiant, still smiling calmly, and gave him a gentle nod. "Please continue." The crunch of their car tires against the gravel driveway faded into the distance, carrying with it the last remnants of daylight. Inside the grand reception barn, the warm amber glow of the string lights should have signaled the beginning of a joyous celebration. Instead, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, choked by the lingering poison of my father's theatrical exit. The 200 guests were seated at their designated round tables, picking awkwardly at their salads, the clinking of silverware serving as the only inadequate cover for their urgent, bewildered whispers. They were waiting for me to apologize, to explain away the massive accusations of theft and familial sabotage that had just been publicly hurled at me. I did not need a master of ceremonies to handle this. I stood up from the sweetheart table, my ivory suit contrasting sharply against the dimly lit room. I walked with measured, unhurried steps toward the center of the wooden dance floor, a wireless microphone grasped firmly in my hand. The murmurs died instantly. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me, wide with anticipation. My parents just delivered a very passionate monologue regarding honesty and transparency. I began, my voice amplified clearly across the expansive room. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. My tone was clinical, precise, and utterly devoid of the emotional wreckage they had hoped to leave behind. So, in the spirit of absolute transparency, I believe it is only fair that we examine what honesty actually looks like. I turned my head slightly, catching Levi's eye where he stood at the edge of the room. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Levi tapped the encrypted tablet. The amber string lights completely blacked out, plunging the barn into a sudden, disorienting darkness. A second later, the massive LED video wall, brilliantly concealed behind the cascading orchid curtains, roared to life. The sheer scale and high-definition brightness of the screen forced the guests to physically recoil in their chairs. Tier 1 of the exposure commenced. The screen displayed the stark black and white security footage from my home office. There was no audio at first, just the undeniable crystal-clear visual of Jane. The crowd watched paralyzed as the impeccably dressed matriarch produced a sharp blade and began systematically and ruthlessly slashing the interior seams of my custom bridal gown. Then the audio kicked in. Jane's cruel, calculating mutter echoed through the venue's surround sound system, "Teach her a lesson in humility." A collective gasp of genuine horror ripped through the room. Several guests from Levi's side of the family covered their mouths. The pristine image of the loving, heartbroken mother had just been publicly slaughtered on a digital altar. But I wasn't finished. I didn't give the audience time to recover from the shock. Levi swiped the tablet again. Tier 2 illuminated the screen. The video feed vanished, replaced by a massive, razor-sharp infographic that Levi had meticulously designed. It was a digital map of financial treason. On the left side of the screen was the bank statement from my joint investment fund, clearly highlighting the withdrawal of exactly $85,000. Red animated arrows tracked the money's movement, transferring directly into a registered Missouri LLC named Crescent Valley Materials. The next arrow pointed to the LLC's official registration documents, proving it was a newly created shell company. The final damning arrow connected the shell company directly to Lumiere Events, the luxury wedding agency currently orchestrating Hazel's extravagant reception downtown. The undeniable proof of embezzlement hung in the air, 20 feet tall. Joseph hadn't just lied at the altar. He was a thief who had weaponized his daughter's trust fund to finance a popularity contest for his favorite child. The barn was no longer just silent. The air had turned thick with a volatile, palpable outrage. People were no longer looking at me with pity. They were staring at the screen with absolute disgust. Then came Tier 3. The screen faded to a solid, stark black background. An audio waveform appeared, pulsing in time with a recorded phone conversation. This was the final nail in the coffin, a recording secured legally through Aunt Clara's aggressive investigative channels in a one-party consent state prior to the wedding. Joseph's unmistakable gravelly voice echoed through the speakers, laced with dripping arrogance and unapologetic entitlement. "The money is in my hands," Joseph sneered on the recording. "I am funneling it into Hazel's wedding, and there is absolutely nothing Autumn can do about it. She'll just have to deal with it like a grown adult." The audio file clicked off, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The psychological dam broke. The outrage that had been simmering in the room violently boiled over. Conversations erupted at every table, no longer hushed whispers, but loud, angry condemnations. Relatives who had known Joseph for decades were shaking their heads in profound revulsion. Suddenly, the scraping of a wooden chair violently pushing back against the floorboard cut through the noise. Aunt Clara stood up. At 61, the formidable family law attorney possessed a commanding presence that naturally demanded absolute silence. She didn't look at the screen. She turned to face the entire room of stunned guests. Her face was flushed with a terrifying, righteous fury. "What you have all just witnessed is not just a family dispute," Clara announced, her voice booming with the authority of a courtroom judge delivering a sentence. She pointed a trembling finger toward the exit where her sister had just fled. "That is grand larceny. That is a malicious destruction of property. And as an officer of the court, and more importantly, as Autumn's aunt, I am standing right here to officially declare that the moral rot of my own sister and brother-in-law has just been exposed for exactly what it is. They are criminals." The room erupted. The truth once unleashed into the wild possesses a catastrophic power, far more profound and irrevocable than any screamed curse or shattered physical object. When the lights came back on in the reception barn, the illusion of my parents' pristine upper-class reputation had been incinerated. The guests did not just leave, they carried the digital evidence and the scandalous reality out into the world, spreading it through every social circle, country club, and corporate network in the city. Aunt Clara had not made an empty threat in the heat of the moment. Returning to Chicago, she utilized her extensive legal network to ensure that the fallout was not merely social gossip, but a rigorous judicial reckoning. The meticulously documented financial trail Levi had uncovered was handed directly over to the authorities. Within weeks, the Internal Revenue Service launched a full-scale criminal audit into Joseph's contracting firm. In the United States, utilizing a newly formed corporate LLC to secretly funnel business capital into a private, untaxed wedding expenditure is not just a family dispute. It is a textbook case of wire fraud and tax evasion. The federal investigation acted like a wrecking ball through their lives. Because the stolen $85,000 had been routed directly into the accounts of Lumiere Events, Hazel was instantly dragged into the epicenter of the legal nightmare. She was formally investigated for the receipt of illicit laundered funds. Her spectacular, highly anticipated downtown wedding quickly devolved into a notorious crime scene. The vendors demanded cash up front, terrified of asset freezes, and the high society guests she had so desperately tried to impress quietly canceled their RSVPs, wanting absolutely no association with a pending federal indictment. The flawless, aristocratic image Hazel had sacrificed her own sister to build was entirely obliterated, leaving her as a localized laughingstock. Joseph's punishment was swift and uncompromising, facing severe felony charges for a breach of fiduciary duty and corporate embezzlement. The Missouri Division of Professional Registration formally revoked his general contractor's license. His business partners severed their contracts overnight, disgusted by the sheer lack of ethics he had displayed toward his own flesh and blood. Meanwhile, Jane found herself entirely ostracized. The prestigious local Women's Auxiliary Board, an organization she had spent a decade climbing, held a quiet emergency meeting and permanently revoked her membership. They were entirely stripped of their wealth, their social standing, and their manufactured pride. When a narcissist loses their audience and their control, their desperation becomes frantic. My phone began to light up with incoming calls at all hours of the day and night. My voicemail inbox quickly filled to maximum capacity. The messages were pathetic symphonies of sobbing apologies, frantic begging, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. Joseph's voice, once booming with absolute authority, was now reduced to a trembling, broken tremor asking for a second chance. Jane left rambling, tear-soaked monologues about how she had made a terrible mistake and just wanted her beautiful daughter back. But I did not block their numbers. I did not change my contact information. Blocking them would have given them the closure of a slammed door. It would have allowed them to paint themselves as the tragic victims of a cold, unforgiving daughter. Instead, I left the lines wide open. I let their calls ring and ring and ring, echoing endlessly into the void. I listened to their voicemails feeling absolutely nothing before deleting them with a single tap of my finger. I punished them with the most terrifying weapon you can use against people who crave validation: complete, absolute, and permanent silence. They were forced to wake up every single day knowing that the lines of communication were technically open, but they were utterly invisible to me. They ceased to exist in my universe. The storm eventually settled, leaving behind a clear, unburdened horizon. I stood in the center of a spacious, light-filled commercial loft in downtown Kansas City, the exposed brick walls and massive industrial windows offering a breathtaking view of the skyline. I was still wearing the sharp ivory crepe suit from my wedding day, the armor I had chosen over a ruined gown. Levi stood beside me, a proud, quiet anchor handing me a sleek silver pen. I leaned over the solid oak desk and signed my name at the bottom of a massive, multi-year commercial lease. It was the official headquarters for my new independent architectural firm. My parents had tried to destroy my foundation, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. I didn't need their money, their approval, or their twisted version of love to build my life. I had designed the blueprints of my own future, and the foundation I was standing on was entirely unshakably mine. The value and perspective of the story. This story extends far beyond the confines of a dramatic wedding disaster. It serves as a powerful, unflinching masterclass in setting boundaries and dismantling toxic family dynamics. The core lesson here is the stark realization that sharing DNA does not automatically grant someone a lifelong VIP pass to disrespect, manipulate, or financially abuse you. Society often pushes the narrative that family is everything, and that one must always forgive and forget for the sake of peace. However, Autumn's journey boldly challenges the societal pressure, proving that true peace sometimes requires burning the bridge that your abusers are standing on. From the audience's perspective, this narrative is profoundly cathartic. Viewers who have suffered under the weight of narcissistic parents or golden child syndromes often comment on the sheer satisfaction of seeing calculated, legally grounded justice served. They applaud the transition from a passive victim crying over a shredded dress to a strategic architect of her own vindication. The story resonates deeply because it validates a very harsh but necessary reality: you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Ultimately, the most valuable takeaway is the power of the sentence of silence. The story teaches us that the ultimate revenge is not a screaming match or a physical altercation, but total indifference. Success, independence, and absolute silence are the sharpest weapons against those who try to destroy you. Families are not just born, they are built. And sometimes you have to tear down the rotten structure to build a sanctuary of your own.